Hello, my name is Jennifer Koreb, and my research presentation is going to be on interviews. As you prepare for an interview process, you need to decide on a format. Do you want individual interviews or a focus group? You need to consider the quality of responses and efficiency of each. You'll choose one or the other based on your kind of research question or the topics being discussed. Naturally, sensitive topics are better suited to individual interviews because then people don't have to worry about everybody else in the group hearing their answers, whereas a more casual topic would call for a focus group. Since you could save time that way, you wouldn't have to schedule individual interviews necessarily. You can also decide if you need structured, semi-structured, or unstructured interviews. And you will need to know what those mean. So, structured interviews involve several short questions. Responses are expected to be short as well. Questions are posed in the same order with every interviewee. Semi-structured interviews involve 6 to 12 carefully chosen questions used as a guide for all interviews but adapted slightly to each interview. Each question may have 2 to 4 sub-questions or prompts that the interviewer can use to find out more about a given response the interviewee may give. Unstructured interviews involve the interview being based on a few carefully chosen topics or prompts. Emphasis is given on encouraging the respondent to talk about a theme, rather than structured questions. The interviewer may adapt their questions to how each interviewee responds to the previous questions. You also need to decide the mode of the interview, whether it be in person, over the phone, Skype, or email. Naturally, when you think of an interview, you usually think of an in-person interview, but there are also ways to give an interview over more asynchronous methods. You need to consider the pros and cons of each. For example, face-to-face interviews have the benefit of the richness of the in-person experience. You can also observe the person's facial expressions, their verbal and nonverbal cues, the way they're answering questions, their comfortability with the interview, although the interviewees may not have time to meet in person due to scheduling or distance constraints. One benefit of the telephone interview is that it's easier to conduct interviews with someone who lives far away. You can just call them and have the interview that way. Although this research method through the interview of telephone would lack the richness of experience of in-person interaction. Skype is kind of a compromise in between telephone and face-to-face because you can allow the person to have the interview on their own time, at home, for instance, in the comfort of their own home. So it's convenient for people who live far away or have busy schedules. You could even use webcam to be able to actually see their face and their verbal reactions, nonverbal reactions to an extent. But it still wouldn't be quite the same as being in person, conducting an in-person interview. Email actually gives the most convenience for the interviewee because they can simply answer the email on their own time. But this allows the greatest lack of richness of in-person interaction because there's no real-time interaction. There's no way to actually get to know the person or observe their vocal or nonverbal cues. Once you've decided what kind of interview you need to gather any research materials that you need. You may need a tape recorder if you're going to record the interview. You'll need extra batteries, extra tapes, just to make sure that you don't lose your data. You'll need a notepad and pen to take notes because it's also actually a best practice to take notes even if you're recording an interview, just to make sure the person knows you're listening, and in case you lose any data through the tapes, somehow at least you'd still have your notes. And you may also need specialized interview data processing software such as InVivo, or you may just want to use something like word processing software so you could sort the data that way. Once you're ready to get started on the interview process, first you need to identify your respondent group and representatives from that group. You need to obtain permission to approach individuals. For individuals under the age of 19, minors, parental consent is needed in writing. For other individuals in vulnerable populations, which include not just minors, but the mentally incompetent, pregnant women, prisoners, those with neurological disorders, victims, and those with AIDS. Special permission will need to have been obtained from the IRB board and gatekeepers of organizations with which these individuals are affiliated. You also need to arrange for consent from individuals to be interviewed once you actually have their permission to speak with them. Individuals need to know what the research is about, why they've been chosen to be interviewed, and how the information they share during the interview will be treated. All individuals need to sign an informed consent form. Schedule interviews based on the availability of respondents. During the interview process, you need to manage your time effectively. You need to get answers to as many questions as possible. You should encourage elaboration on points of particular interest, but don't interrupt the train of thought of the interviewee. Just make sure to make a note to ask them more about it at the end of it if there's time. On the other hand, if they're dwelling too long on a particular topic which isn't really relevant to your research question, you may gently urge them along so as to leave time for the rest of the questions. You also need to maintain best practices for ethical standards. Remind individuals everything that they share will be kept completely confidential. You may also want to record a confidentiality statement just to make sure that everybody involved in the research knows that you gave this statement to this person, so it's on record that they are completely aware of the confidentiality and ethical issues of this interview. They will also be able to review your recording, transcript, or notes after the interview if they wish. All the while, you need to decide how much to disclose to individuals, whether they be interviewees or gatekeepers, about your research agenda. They have the right to know the basic premise behind the research, but avoid allowing the responses to be colored by research bias or your own personal theories. While you're conducting your interview, you should try to treat it more as a conversation than a strict question-answer format, because you want them to feel as comfortable as possible. You want them to feel that they can express themselves openly to you as a friend or colleague. After the interview, transcribe any recordings, sort data by similar responses to questions. Share transcriptions or notes with the respondents to confirm with them what was discussed and gain any reflections on their part. You may also want to give them a copy of the recording, just so they can have it for themselves. You will then need to analyze the data and determine what conclusions can be made. As you're analyzing your data, you should probably work off a copy of a tape if you've made a tape, because you don't want to lose the data of the original. So work off your copy and analyze the data, whether it's through your specialized interviewing software programs such as NVivo, or probably in cases of more casual interviews, you could just use word processing software to chunk the data based on similar responses to questions, which will then allow you to analyze the data and decide, is evidence supportive of or contrary to your theory? What did you learn that you didn't know before? Would you have done anything differently? Did your interview draw your attention to anything you hadn't considered before that might modify your research question or bring up new potential topics for the future? The interview method has both strengths and weaknesses. Some strengths of the interview process are flexibility of topics discussed. Semi-structured or unstructured methods allow spontaneous reactions in interviewees and exploration of new topics that may arise during the process that could lead to new theories. You can also gain a meaningful variety of insights from an interview. People generally enjoy sharing with themselves and their opinions. Opportunity to observe both verbal and nonverbal reactions is very strong on an interview, especially if it's in person. People may prefer an interview to filling out a questionnaire. There are also potential weaknesses of the interview. Subjects may have trouble with an interview format, may be nervous about speaking on the record. They may not feel they can openly express themselves if only given a rigid set of questions to answer. You may also need to consider time and distance logistics. Interviews take a lot of time and do not allow as many respondents as a survey or other method. You may not gather enough data to truly represent the population you are studying. You may also need to consider the time and distance constraints of interviewees. You may need to compromise on an interview method. You may need to choose email versus in-person if your interviewee is not able to meet in person, which may lead to a less meaningful interaction. Use of interviews in reference services. In reference services, librarians use interviews in the form of the reference interview. This is when a librarian and a user collaborate, come together, they sit down, or sometimes they collaborate online through IM reference, which is used in many universities. They identify the user's information need, and they identify the library's resources that can meet that need. The librarian and the user are two knowledgeable equals. The user knows most about their information need. The librarian knows most about the library resources. The user is held accountable for their needs. Students can't hand over a problem for an assignment. They need to understand an assignment and work with the librarian to locate proper resources. The reference interview is very helpful for students because it allows the librarian to be a companion and a support to a student who's having a difficult time. The librarian provides optimism and companionship to improve conditions of what could otherwise have been a frustrating experience for the user. These are my references that I used for this assignment. I hope you've learned a few things about the interview if you'd like to use it for your own research proposal, for example. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.